right. Hello. Coming to you from Ratcliffe, Arkansas, one of my favorite places in the world. While we're in quarantine, I've now reunited with my family out here, and so I'm coming to you from a distance. We learned a few things from my cow friends here, which you'll hear probably moo a couple times here and there. Is they digest things a little differently than we do. If we were to take that as a spiritual lesson, we should probably chew the cud, right? We take something in, we pull it back out, we gnaw on it some more and take it back in. And what I've been gnawing on since since this whole pandemic has descended upon us is a lot of things, but one of them is the nature of our reception of communion, actually. How is it that God allows for us now to go through even potentially Holy Week without physically receiving him in the body, blood, soul, and divinity? I've always, as a convert, appreciated how the church says, "Blessed, blessed are those who are called to the supper of the Lamb," and I always counted myself in that because, in a special way, because I was a convert. I knew God had pulled me in a special way, and I counted myself as blessed for that, and I still do, but it has to deepen now. It has to deepen in a different way, and I find myself drawing on a certain kind of spirituality that I maybe had put on the shelf. I think that maybe you, like me, have taken for granted somewhat our Sundays or even daily communication, as in taking communion, and the old way of talking about it. Looking at the history of communion, this is not totally unusual that the faithful might not have access to communion in the same way. In the early church, the patristic times, it wasn't quite clear exactly how often you would receive communion. It seemed like everybody was receiving on the Lord's Day, for sure. If you just look at Acts and Corinthians, and if you looked at the witness of the scriptures, at least Sundays, it seemed that all the faithful were receiving Jesus then. In Acts, it seemed, or one part in Acts, it seems like they're even receiving daily. In some parts, some early fathers pushed for daily communion. St. Basil was a fan, for example. But others thought maybe it could be problematic, that it would cheapen what you're getting, and so pressed against frequent communion. There wasn't a clear doctrine. Surprisingly, there wasn't a clear doctrine, right? St. Augustine, for example, and I believe Jerome, they saw, the idea of frequent communion on a more regular basis, weekly, daily, that could be commendable, but on the other hand, abstaining for times could be commendable for reasons as well. And so there isn't a clear precedent. Even up to the Council of Trent, the Catechism of the Council of Trent talks about there being a need to go to communion at least once a year. That's precept. You have to go to communion once a year. That was Fourth Lateran, and let me come back to that. But it says that's not enough. You really should receive communion more often. Ideally, every time you go to Mass, you receive communion, maybe even more frequently than that, potentially daily. And insofar as you're receiving communion in this way, you should, whether or not it should be daily, monthly, or weekly, they couldn't put a precept on it. They said it's not a matter of precept. It's one of those things that requires spiritual discernment, discernment from church leaders and one spiritual director, for example, or maybe at given times it might be a worthwhile thing to do is to withhold oneself from going to communion, even apart from being in a state of sin. And so during this time, I've been reading back over the scriptures having to do with the Eucharist, and one that really struck me, and maybe it would strike you too, is from 1 Corinthians 11. And the thing that got me is normally we think that getting together for Mass on Sundays is just always a good thing. And generally, that's true in and of itself. But strikingly, St. Paul in 1 Corinthians says that those meetings, the meetings of the faithful on the Lord's Day, were doing more harm than good in his situation. It says, in giving this instruction, I do not praise the fact that your meetings are doing more harm than good. This is 1 Corinthians 17, starting there. First of all, I hear that when you meet as a church, there are divisions among you, and to a degree I believe it. Right? So is that not the case too in the Catholic Church oftentimes? How much we're really divided internally. We go to communion, we have external communion with one another, but there's a great division still within our church, and that is not pleasing to God. Even now, as our leaders, our church leaders have almost unanimously come to their the prudential judgment to say no mass for now. Many have felt the need to go against that, or at least be really outspoken and frustrated, as though this is just bad leadership. I think this is a sign of a kind of division, probably not the right route to take. I think of we've had a real strike to the church and our belief in the goodness always of our leadership. Sometimes in the last year, especially the last 2 years, but the idea that God is still guiding the church through the leadership is one that still requires a certain act of faith on our part, and gives us a place for our visible communion. So our communion isn't just with the vertical with God; it's also horizontal with ourselves, which includes with our leaders. And so, what a strange thing it would be to be pressing for communion in a certain kind of disobedience, So that's just one little mark, this division piece, right? To a degree, I believe it, that there have to be factions among you in order that those who are proved among you may become known. All right, so he says, yeah, there's got to be division every once in a while because, the weeds and the wheat are sown together. When you meet in one place, then, it is not to eat the Lord's Supper. For in eating, each one goes ahead with his own supper, and one goes hungry while another gets drunk. Right? The great divisions, even in our giving of ourselves materially, that some have extreme wealth and others extreme poverty, and there isn't the proper sharing, there isn't proper generosity. So communion isn't quite real. One goes hungry, another gets drunk. Do you not have houses in which you can eat and drink? Wow, is that not a lesson, right? Yeah, I do, right? And that's what we've all been relegated to is our houses. Or do you show contempt for the church of God and make those who have nothing feel ashamed? What can I say to you? Shall I praise you? In this matter, I do not praise you. And then Paul goes into the what we normally hear in Mass of the Lord's Supper, that he received this from the Lord, and that he's handed it on to the church. The night he was betrayed, he took bread and so on. And then he gets back to it. It says, therefore, whoever eats the bread or drinks the cup of the Lord unworthily will have to answer for the body and blood of the Lord. So in other words, if you receive unworthily the kind of sacrilegious communion, you'd be subject to, you're not responsible for doing something good, you're responsible for the body and blood of Christ. In other words, it's like you're crucifying him. A person should then examine himself and so eat the bread and drink the cup. For anyone who eats and drinks without discerning the body eats and drinks judgment on himself. Whenever I was wondering whether or not communion was real, the Eucharist, whether there was a real presence or not, or if it was just symbolic, that got me big time. This is probably the verse that sunk my ship, that you have to discern the body and blood of Christ or eat and drink judgment upon yourself. This is not simply symbolic activity. This is discerning the body and blood. You really discern the body and blood. The recent Pew research that we've maybe all heard is that 70% of Catholics believe it's just symbolic and not real, contrary to the Church's teaching. There's actually in discord with the Church's teaching. So that's a division. It's also failing to discern the body and blood. So every Sunday, our meetings, has it been doing more harm than good? How many sacrilegious communions are happening? And so it's just striking to me. I don't know what to think of it. But let's keep going, right? This is why many among you are ill and infirm, and a considerable number are dying. If we discerned ourselves, we would not be under judgment, but since we are judged by the Lord, We are being disciplined so that we may not be condemned along with the world. Therefore, my brothers, when you come together to eat, wait for one another. If anyone is hungry, he should eat at home, so that your meetings may not result in judgment. The other matters I shall set in order when I come. Okay, so I'm not saying necessarily that our situation is kind of divine wrath or anything like that per se, because I think it's just above my pay grade. I don't know. But there's clearly a time to reflect now on what we have in the Eucharist. We've been called to that this last year, especially with the results of these inventories, these faith inventories, of whether or not we really believe or not. And we should really examine ourselves and discern the body and blood and make sure that we really are in communion with one another, and that our divisions are healed, and that we live in an orderly way with it as the church. Now, I think this will probably be part one, right? That's probably good enough for one sitting. But I invite you to read it and meditate and think about it, and leave some comments. I'd love to have your thoughts on it, because this is some of the examination that I have as I kind of chew the cud a bit, wondering what are we to make of a world that has been struck by pandemic, in which that we can't receive the body of our Lord. That doesn't happen without somehow God governing, without God's at least approval in some way. Why would he allow for this? And so let's ask him. Let's ask him with earnest hearts and readiness to change, that we don't go back to the way we were, whatever that was before this time, that we come out of it better, that somehow we do not resist, that we actually are changed when this season of our world has passed and we move into something different, that we are different too.